The morning sun painted the Texas plains in shades of gold and amber as Samuel Mackenzie rode across his vast ranch. The year was 1887, and the land stretched endlessly before him, dotted with cattle that represented years of hard work and sacrifice. Samuel had built this ranch from nothing, arriving in Texas 20 years earlier with little more than determination and a worn saddle. At 45, Samuel was a man shaped by the harsh realities of frontier life. His weathered hands told stories of countless days working under the blazing sun, and his keen eyes missed nothing as he surveyed his domain. The ranch employed over 30 men, making it one of the largest operations in the county. Samuel took pride in treating his workers fairly, paying them well, and ensuring they had decent living quarters. As he approached the eastern boundary of his property, something caught his attention. Smoke was rising from beyond the hills. Too much smoke for a simple campfire. Samuel urged his horse forward, his instincts telling him something was wrong. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of burning wood became, mixed with something else that made his stomach turn. Cresting the hill, Samuel pulled his horse to an abrupt stop. Below him lay the remnants of what had once been a small homestead. The wooden cabin was reduced to smoldering ruins, and scattered around the property were signs of violence. Furniture lay broken and scattered, and the vegetable garden had been trampled by horses. Samuel dismounted carefully, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle secured to his saddle. He had seen enough Indian raids and outlaw attacks to know the signs, but something about this scene felt different. The destruction was too thorough, too deliberate. This wasn't the work of desperate men looking for supplies or revenge. As he walked through the debris, Samuel began to piece together what had happened. The family that lived here, the Hendersons, had been quiet folk who kept to themselves. They had 3 children, all under the age of 10, and had been trying to make a living farming the difficult land. Samuel had offered to buy their property several times, not to expand his own holdings, but because he knew they were struggling and wanted to help them find a better life elsewhere. The sound of a horse whinnying in distress drew Samuel's attention to a small grove of trees behind the ruined cabin. There, partially hidden by the undergrowth, he found a mare with an arrow in her flank. The animal was clearly in pain but alive. More disturbing was what he found near the horse: children's clothing torn and scattered, and small footprints in the dirt leading away from the homestead. Samuel's blood ran cold as he realized what this meant. The Henderson children had survived the attack, but they had been taken. In this part of Texas, that could mean only one thing. They had been captured, either by the remnants of hostile Indian bands that still roamed the territory, or by the even more dangerous gangs of outlaws who trafficked in human misery. He followed the tracks as far as he could, but they led into rocky terrain where the trail became impossible to follow. The sun was beginning to set, and Samuel knew he needed help. He mounted his horse and rode hard back to his ranch, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. When he arrived at the ranch house, his foreman, a grizzled veteran named Jake Morrison, was waiting with the day's reports. One look at Samuel's face told Jake that something serious had happened. Samuel quickly explained what he had found, and Jake's expression grew grim. Both men knew the reality of the situation. Children who were taken rarely survived long, and even if they did, finding them in the vast wilderness was nearly impossible. The local sheriff was a good man, but understaffed and limited in resources. The army was stationed too far away to be of immediate help. That night, Samuel sat in his study, staring at maps of the surrounding territory. He had built his ranch through careful planning and smart decisions, but this situation demanded something different. This required the kind of risks that could destroy everything he had worked for. His wife, Martha, had died 3 years earlier from fever, and they had never been blessed with children of their own. Perhaps that was why the thought of the Henderson children suffering somewhere in the wilderness affected him so deeply. He imagined them cold, frightened, and calling out for help that might never come. Samuel knew he had several options. He could report the incident to the authorities and let them handle it through official channels. He could offer a reward for information and hope that someone would come forward. Or he could take matters into his own hands, using his resources and connections to mount a private rescue operation. Each choice carried enormous risks. If he acted outside the law, he could lose everything: his ranch, his reputation, possibly even his life. But if he did nothing more than go through official channels, those children would almost certainly die. As the night wore on, Samuel found himself thinking about the kind of man he wanted to be. He had always prided himself on being practical and level-headed, qualities that had served him well in building his ranch. But sometimes, he realized, being a good man meant being willing to risk everything for what was right. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Samuel Mackenzie had not built his ranch by avoiding difficult choices, and he would not start now. Whatever it took, wherever it led, he was going to find those children and bring them home. The cost, both personal and financial, was something he would worry about later. As dawn broke over the Texas plains, Samuel began making preparations that would change his life forever. He had no way of knowing that his choice would lead him into the most dangerous adventure of his life, or that the path ahead would test not only his courage but his very soul. Samuel spent the early morning hours selecting his most trusted men for the mission ahead. He knew that not everyone on his ranch would be willing to risk their lives for strangers, and he respected that choice. This had to be a volunteer operation, with every man understanding the dangers they would face. Jake Morrison was the first to step forward, as Samuel had expected. The older man had fought in the Civil War and understood the harsh realities of violence and loss. "Those kids deserve a chance," he said simply, checking his rifle. "Count me in, boss." 3 other ranch hands volunteered. Miguel Santos, a skilled tracker who had once served as a scout for the Army. Tom Bradley, a young but steady cowboy who was the best shot on the ranch. And Ben Carter, a former Texas Ranger who had joined Samuel's crew just 6 months earlier, seeking a quieter life. Samuel also made an unexpected decision that morning. He sent a rider to the nearby Comanche reservation to speak with Chief Running Bear, a man he had dealt with in business matters before. If Indian raiders had taken the children, Running Bear might have information. If outlaws were responsible, the chief's warriors might be willing to help track them down, as both groups had been victimized by the same criminal bands. The response came back faster than expected. Running Bear himself arrived at the ranch before noon, accompanied by 2 of his best warriors. The chief was a dignified man in his 60s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened carefully as Samuel described what he had found at the Henderson homestead. "This was not done by my people," Running Bear said firmly. "We do not take children in this way, but I know who does." His expression grew dark. "There is a man called Scar Wilson who leads a band of outlaws. They take people to sell across the border. We have lost 2 of our own young ones to these men." The chief's words confirmed Samuel's worst fears. Scar Wilson was a name that struck terror throughout the region. A former Confederate soldier who had turned to crime after the war, Wilson led a ruthless gang that specialized in kidnapping and human trafficking. They would take their captives deep into Mexico, where they would disappear forever into a world of slavery and suffering. Running Bear's offer to help was both surprising and welcome. "My warriors and I will ride with you," he said, "but we must move quickly. Wilson's trail grows cold with each passing hour, and once his band crosses into Mexico, even we cannot follow." The combined group set out that afternoon, following the tracks that Samuel had discovered the previous day. Miguel and the Comanche warriors worked together to read the signs, their combined skills allowing them to follow a trail that would have been impossible for any one tracker to manage alone. The pursuit led them through increasingly rough terrain, across rocky canyons and through dense mesquite thickets that tore at their clothes and slowed their horses. As they rode, Running Bear shared what he knew about Wilson's methods. The outlaw leader was cunning and cruel, but he followed certain patterns that might help them predict his movements. "Wilson has 3 places where he hides," the chief explained. "An old mine in the Guadalupe Mountains, a canyon hideout near the Pecos River, and a ranch house abandoned since the Apache Wars. He moves between them, never staying in one place too long." As the sun began to set on their first day of pursuit, the tracking party found evidence that made their hearts sink. The trail split into 3 separate paths, each leading in a different direction. Wilson had divided his band, making it nearly impossible to know which group had the children. Samuel felt the weight of decision pressing down on him again. They had to choose which trail to follow, and if they chose wrong, the Henderson children would be lost forever. The practical thing to do would be to split their own group, but that would leave each party dangerously outnumbered if they found Wilson's men. Ben Carter, the former Texas Ranger, studied the 3 trails carefully. The middle trail shows signs of slower movement, he observed. Could be they're having to manage captives who can't keep up with the pace. It was their best lead, and Samuel made the decision to follow it. As they rode through the gathering darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Wilson was known for posting sentries and setting ambushes for anyone foolish enough to pursue him. The feeling proved justified when Miguel suddenly held up his hand, signaling for the group to stop. Ahead of them, barely visible in the moonlight, was a flickering campfire. The tracker had spotted it just in time to prevent them from riding directly into what could be a trap. Samuel and Running Bear dismounted and crept forward to observe the camp. What they saw made Samuel's blood boil. 3 men sat around the fire, and nearby, huddled together under a thin blanket, were 2 small figures. Even from a distance, Samuel could see that they were children. Though he couldn't tell if they were the Henderson kids, the outlaws were taking turns keeping watch, but they seemed confident that no one had followed them this far into the wilderness. Their arrogance would be their downfall, Samuel thought grimly. But rescuing the children would require careful planning. One wrong move could result in the captives being killed out of spite. As they watched, one of the children began to cry softly. The sound carried clearly in the still night air, and one of the outlaws kicked dirt in the child's direction, growling a harsh warning. Samuel's hands clenched into fists, and he had to fight the urge to charge into the camp immediately. Running Bear placed a calming hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Patience," the chief whispered. "We must be smart about this. The children's lives depend on it." They spent the next hour studying the camp layout and the outlaws' routine. The men were clearly not expecting trouble, but they were still dangerous and well armed. Any rescue attempt would have to be swift and decisive. As Samuel lay in the darkness planning their next move, he thought about the choice he had made back at his ranch. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened in the hours ahead would determine not only the fate of the Henderson children, but the kind of man Samuel Mackenzie would prove himself to be. The rescue had to wait until the outlaws settled into their deepest sleep, which Running Bear estimated would come just before dawn. Samuel and his men used the intervening hours to position themselves around the camp, each man knowing exactly what he had to do when the signal came. Miguel would approach from the east, using his skills to get close enough to cut the ropes binding the children. Tom Bradley would provide cover from a rocky outcrop with his rifle, while Ben Carter moved in from the north to secure the outlaws' weapons. Jake Morrison would stay with the horses, ready for a quick escape if things went wrong. Samuel and Running Bear would create a distraction from the west, drawing the outlaws' attention away from the children. It was dangerous, but it was their best chance of getting the kids out alive. As the night wore on, Samuel found himself studying the 2 small figures huddled by the dying campfire. One appeared to be a girl of about 8 years old, while the other was smaller, perhaps 5 or 6. They had stopped crying, but even from a distance, Samuel could see how frightened they were. The outlaws had finally settled down for the night, though one remained awake as a sentry. This man was the biggest challenge to their plan. He sat with his back against a tree, rifle across his knees, occasionally scanning the darkness around the camp. Running Bear had a solution for this problem. The chief was known for his ability to move silently through any terrain, a skill that had served him well in countless hunts and battles. "Give me 10 minutes, he whispered to Samuel. "When you hear the owl call twice, begin moving toward the camp." Samuel watched as the Comanche chief seemed to melt into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness. It was an impressive display of skill that reminded Samuel why the tribes had been such formidable opponents for so many years. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Samuel checked his pocket watch repeatedly, the ticking seeming impossibly loud in the quiet night. Around him he could sense his men growing tense as they waited for the signal. Then it came. 2 soft owl calls that sounded completely natural to anyone who didn't know what to listen for. Samuel began moving forward, his heart pounding as he crept closer to the camp. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid making noise that might alert the sleeping outlaws. When he reached his position, Samuel could see that Running Bear had succeeded. The sentry was slumped forward, unconscious but alive. The chief believed in showing mercy whenever possible, even to his enemies. Now came the most critical part of the operation. Samuel had to trust that his men were in position and ready to act. He picked up a small stone and threw it toward the opposite side of the camp, where it landed with a soft thud among some bushes. The sound was enough to wake the lightest sleeper among the outlaws, a thin man with a scraggly beard who sat up immediately and reached for his gun. "What was that?" he muttered, shaking his companion awake. This was the moment Samuel had been waiting for. As the two conscious outlaws focused their attention on the sound, Miguel crept toward the children from behind. The tracker moved like a ghost, his years of experience serving him well. The little girl saw Miguel approaching and opened her mouth to cry out in fear. But the tracker quickly put a finger to his lips and whispered softly in Spanish, "I'm here to help. Stay quiet." Something in his gentle tone must have reassured her because she nodded and remained silent. Miguel's knife made quick work of the ropes binding the children. He gathered them close and began moving them away from the camp. But the youngest child, a boy, stumbled over a loose rock and fell with a small cry of pain. The sound was enough to alert the outlaws. "Hey!" one of them shouted, spinning around to see the escaping children. "They're getting away." The careful rescue plan suddenly became a desperate fight. Tom Bradley's rifle cracked from his position on the ridge, and one of the outlaws spun and fell. Ben Carter emerged from the shadows to tackle the second man, the two of them rolling in the dirt as they struggled for control of a pistol. Samuel found himself face to face with the third outlaw, a massive man with arms like tree trunks and murder in his eyes. The man swung a heavy club at Samuel's head, forcing the rancher to duck and roll to avoid the crushing blow. "You made a big mistake coming after us," the outlaw snarled, swinging the club again. "Wilson don't like folks interfering with his business." Samuel drew his own pistol, but the big man was faster than he looked. The club knocked the gun from Samuel's hand before he could fire, and suddenly he was fighting for his life with nothing but his bare hands and whatever weapons he could improvise. The battle was fierce but brief. Running Bear appeared behind the big outlaw like an avenging spirit, striking him down with a war club before the man could land a killing blow on Samuel. Meanwhile, Ben Carter had overpowered his opponent, and Miguel was leading the children to safety. As the dust settled, Samuel looked around at the aftermath of their rescue operation. Two of the outlaws were dead, while the third was unconscious and securely tied up. More importantly, both children were alive and relatively unharmed, though clearly traumatized by their ordeal. The little girl, who Samuel now recognized as Mary Henderson, clung to Miguel and refused to let go. Her younger brother Jimmy had a cut on his forehead but was otherwise unhurt. Both children were thin and dirty, showing signs of the rough treatment they had endured, but they were alive. "Where's our ma and pa?" Mary asked in a small voice that broke Samuel's heart. "Are they coming to get us?" Samuel knelt down beside the children, struggling to find words that would be both truthful and gentle. "We're going to take you somewhere safe," he said finally. "There are people who will take care of you." As they prepared to leave the outlaw camp, Ben Carter interrogated the surviving outlaw. The man was sullen and uncooperative at first, but the former Texas Ranger had ways of encouraging conversation. "This was just the advance group," the outlaw finally admitted. "Wilson's got a whole camp set up in Devil's Canyon, maybe 20 men. He's planning something big, a raid on the railroad camp east of here." This news changed everything. Samuel had succeeded in rescuing the Henderson children, but Wilson's main force was still out there, planning more attacks that would claim more innocent lives. The rancher faced another impossible choice: return home with the children and let the authorities handle Wilson, or continue the pursuit and risk everything to stop the outlaw leader once and for all. As dawn broke over the Texas wilderness, Samuel Mackenzie realized that his adventure was far from over. The hardest decision still lay ahead. The rescued Henderson children huddled close to Miguel as the group made camp in a sheltered canyon several miles from the outlaw site. Mary, the 8-year-old girl, had finally stopped shaking, but she watched every shadow with fearful eyes. Little Jimmy kept asking for his parents, and each time Samuel had to gently redirect his questions without revealing the terrible truth. Samuel knew he would eventually have to tell the children what had happened to their family, but not yet. They had been through enough trauma, and breaking such devastating news required the right time and place. For now it was enough that they were safe and beginning to trust their rescuers. Ben Carter continued questioning the captured outlaw, whose name was revealed to be Pete Rawlings. The man was a small-time criminal who had joined Wilson's gang only recently, but he knew enough about their operations to paint a disturbing picture. "Wilson's planning to hit the railroad construction camp tomorrow night," Rawlings said, motivated by the promise of lighter treatment if he cooperated. "There's nearly 100 workers there, plus their families. He's got buyers lined up across the border who'll pay top dollar for that many people." The scope of Wilson's planned crime was staggering. The railroad camp contained not just workers but also their wives and children, people who had come west seeking honest work and a better life. If Wilson succeeded, it would be one of the largest mass kidnapping operations in the territory's history. Samuel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders once again. He had accomplished what he set out to do by rescuing the Henderson children, but now he had knowledge of a much larger crime that was about to be committed. Could he simply return home and leave those innocent people to their fate? Running Bear seemed to read Samuel's thoughts. "The railroad camp has no defenses," the chief said quietly. "Wilson will strike fast and hard, taking what he wants before anyone can organize resistance. Many will die, and many more will disappear forever." Jake Morrison, ever practical, pointed out the harsh realities they faced. "Boss, we're 7 men against Wilson's 20. Even with the element of surprise, those aren't good odds. And we've got the children to think about now." Samuel looked at the 2 Henderson kids who were finally eating some of the food Miguel had given them. Mary was beginning to show signs of the spirited girl she had been before this nightmare began, while Jimmy was starting to trust the men who had rescued them. They deserved to be taken to safety, not dragged into another dangerous situation. But Samuel also thought about the families at the railroad camp who had no idea what was coming. Workers who had put in hard days laying track through difficult terrain, wives who were trying to make homes in temporary structures, children who played in the dust between the train cars. They were all going about their normal lives, unaware that tomorrow night would bring terror and tragedy. Tom Bradley, the youngest member of their group, surprised everyone by speaking up. "I've got a sister working as a cook at that railroad camp," he said quietly. "She's got 2 little ones with her. I can't just ride away knowing what's going to happen to them." His words seemed to crystallize something in the group's collective mind. These weren't just nameless strangers they were discussing. They were real people with faces and families and dreams. The kind of people who deserved protection from predators like Scar Wilson. Samuel made his decision, but he was careful to give each man a choice. "I'm going to the railroad camp to warn them and help them prepare a defense," he announced. "But I won't ask any man to follow me into what might be a suicide mission. Anyone who wants to take the children back to the ranch can go with my blessing." To his surprise, not one of his men chose to leave. Even Running Bear and his warriors agreed to continue the fight, though the chief pointed out that they would need a much better plan than their previous frontal assault. "Wilson will have scouts watching the approaches to the railroad camp," Running Bear explained. "He will know we are coming unless we are very clever about how we move." Ben Carter studied the map they had sketched in the dirt, marking what they knew about Wilson's planned attack route and the layout of the railroad camp. "The camp is strung out along about a mile of track," he observed. "That makes it hard to defend, but it also means Wilson will have to spread his men thin to control it all." Samuel realized they would need help from the railroad workers themselves if they had any hope of success. The problem was convincing the camp leaders to take the threat seriously and prepare for battle. On the word of strangers who appeared out of the wilderness, the decision was made to send Miguel ahead with one of Running Bear's warriors to scout the railroad camp and make contact with the workers. They would pose as travelers seeking work, which would allow them to assess the camp's defenses and identify potential leaders among the workers. While Miguel was gone, Samuel faced the difficult task of dealing with the Henderson children. Mary had been asking increasingly pointed questions about when they would see their parents again, and Samuel knew he couldn't put off the conversation much longer. He sat down beside the little girl while she was playing with some smooth stones Miguel had found for her. "Mary, I need to talk to you about your mama and papa," he said gently. The child looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her age. "They're dead, aren't they?" she said quietly. "The bad men killed them." Samuel was taken aback by her directness, but he realized that children often understood more than adults gave them credit for. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm very sorry, but they are gone." Mary nodded solemnly and continued playing with her stones. I figured, she said, they wouldn't have let the bad men take us if they were still alive. What's going to happen to me and Jimmy now? The question hung in the air between them, and Samuel realized he didn't have a good answer. The children had no other family that he knew of, and the local orphanage was already overcrowded. For the moment, all he could do was promise that they would be taken care of. We'll figure something out, he said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. Right now, you just need to focus on being safe and taking care of your little brother. Miguel returned that evening with disturbing news. The railroad camp was even more vulnerable than they had feared. The workers were spread out over a large area with no central leadership and no organized defenses. Most of them were immigrants who spoke little English and had no experience with frontier violence. But there is hope, Miguel added. I found the camp foreman, a man named Patrick O'Sullivan. He fought in the Civil War and knows what real fighting looks like. When I told him what was coming, he believed me. He's willing to help organize a defense if we can get there in time. Samuel felt a spark of hope. With the right preparation and leadership, even untrained workers could put up an effective defense against outlaws who weren't expecting organized resistance. The key would be getting to the camp before Wilson's scouts detected their approach. As they prepared to move out, Samuel took one last look at the Henderson children. They were sleeping peacefully for the first time since their rescue, exhausted by their ordeal but finally beginning to feel safe. Whatever happened at the railroad camp, Samuel was determined that these children would have a chance at a normal life. The ride toward their destiny began in the pre-dawn darkness, with Samuel knowing that the next 24 hours would determine whether he was a hero or a fool. The approach to the railroad camp required careful planning and precise timing. Samuel's group had to reach the workers before Wilson's scouts spotted them, but they also couldn't arrive so early that their warning would be dismissed as the ravings of paranoid strangers. Running Bear's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable. The chief guided them through a series of arroyos and hidden valleys that kept them concealed from any watchers on the surrounding hills. The route was longer and more difficult, but it offered the element of surprise that might mean the difference between success and disaster. The Henderson children rode with Miguel, who had become their unofficial guardian during the journey. Mary had shown remarkable resilience, helping to care for her younger brother and asking intelligent questions about their situation. Jimmy was still struggling to understand what had happened to his family, but he seemed to find comfort in staying close to the gentle tracker. As they neared the railroad camp, Samuel could see the smoke from countless cooking fires rising into the morning sky. The sound of hammers on steel rang across the landscape as the workers began their daily task of laying track across the unforgiving Texas terrain. It was a scene of peaceful industry that would soon be shattered if Wilson's plan succeeded. Patrick O'Sullivan was waiting for them at the edge of the camp, having been alerted by Miguel's earlier visit. The Irish foreman was a stocky man with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. His sharp blue eyes assessed Samuel's group with the practiced gaze of a man who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. So you're the ones who've been chasing Scar Wilson, O'Sullivan said, extending a rough hand to Samuel. Miguel here tells me you rescued some children from his men. That takes courage, I'll give you that. Samuel quickly explained the situation, including Wilson's planned attack on the railroad camp. O'Sullivan listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Samuel finished, the foreman was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the sprawling camp where hundreds of people went about their morning routines. We've heard rumors about Wilson, O'Sullivan finally said. Stories about people disappearing, ranches burned out. But nobody thought he'd be bold enough to attack a camp this size. That's exactly why he'll try it, Ben Carter interjected. Wilson counts on people thinking they're too big a target. He's built his reputation on doing the unexpected. O'Sullivan nodded slowly. Right then, what do you need from us? The next few hours were spent in frantic preparation. O'Sullivan proved to be an excellent organizer, quietly spreading word among the most trusted workers while being careful not to cause a panic that might alert any of Wilson's scouts who might be watching the camp. The challenges were enormous. Most of the workers were laborers, not fighters. They had few weapons beyond the tools of their trade. The camp's layout, stretched along the railroad line for over a mile, made it nearly impossible to defend effectively. Worst of all, they had families to protect. women and children who would be primary targets for Wilson's human trafficking operation. Samuel found himself thrust into the role of military commander, drawing on everything he had learned during his years fighting Comanche raids and dealing with rustlers. The first priority was identifying defensible positions where non-combatants could be sheltered during the attack. A series of reinforced supply cars near the center of the camp offered the best protection. O'Sullivan organized teams to move supplies and create barricades, while Samuel worked with Running Bear to establish observation posts that could provide early warning of Wilson's approach. The cultural barriers initially posed problems. Many of the workers were recent immigrants who spoke little English and were suspicious of any change to their routine. Some of the Irish workers refused to take orders from Running Bear's Comanche warriors, while several Mexican laborers were reluctant to trust anyone associated with Texas law enforcement. O'Sullivan proved instrumental in overcoming these divisions. The foreman spoke enough Spanish to communicate with the Mexican workers, and his reputation for fairness had earned him respect among all the ethnic groups in the camp. More importantly, he had the practical knowledge needed to turn laborers into defenders. "These men know how to work as teams," O'Sullivan explained to Samuel. "They've been moving heavy equipment and coordinating complex tasks for months. We just need to apply those same skills to a different kind of problem." The transformation was remarkable to watch. Within hours, the scattered railroad camp began to take on the appearance of a fortress. Workers who had been laying track that morning were now digging defensive positions and creating obstacles to channel attackers into killing zones. The camp's children, including Mary and Jimmy Henderson, were gathered in the most secure supply car under the protection of several women who had volunteered to act as guards. Mary had insisted on helping, and her calm demeanor seemed to have a steadying effect on the other frightened children. As the sun reached its peak, Miguel returned from a scouting mission with disturbing news. Wilson's band had been spotted moving toward the camp, but they were larger than expected, nearly 30 men instead of the 20 they had been told about. Worse, they had been joined by a group of renegade Indians who were known for their brutality. "Wilson's changed his plan," Miguel reported. "He's not waiting for tonight. They're planning to attack during the siesta, when many of the workers will be resting and the camp is less alert." This news forced a rapid adjustment to their defensive preparations. Workers who had been planning to rest during the hottest part of the day instead took positions behind the barricades they had spent the morning building. The tension in the camp was palpable as everyone waited for the attack that could come at any moment. Samuel found himself positioned with Running Bear and Tom Bradley at the northern edge of the camp, where the terrain offered Wilson's men the best approach route. From their concealed position, they could see for miles across the scrubland, watching for the first signs of the approaching outlaws. The waiting was the hardest part. Samuel checked his rifle for the 100th time and thought about the chain of decisions that had brought him to this moment. Less than a week ago, he had been a successful rancher whose biggest concern was the price of cattle. Now he was preparing to lead a desperate battle against one of the most dangerous criminal gangs in the territory. As the afternoon heat shimmered off the desert floor, a small dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Wilson's army was approaching, and the battle for the railroad camp was about to begin. Samuel thought about Martha, his late wife, and wondered what she would think of the choices he had made. He thought about the Henderson children, safe behind the camp's defenses, and about all the other innocent people whose lives hung in the balance. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he knew he had made the right decision. The dust cloud was getting larger, and Samuel could begin to make out individual riders. There was no turning back now. The attack came with the fury of a summer thunderstorm. Wilson's men approached the railroad camp in 3 groups, exactly as Ben Carter had predicted they would. The main force rode straight down the center toward the camp's heart, while smaller groups attempted to circle around both flanks to cut off any escape routes. Samuel watched through his field glasses as the outlaws drew closer. He could see Scar Wilson himself leading the central charge, a tall man with a distinctive white hat and a rifle held high above his head. The scar that gave him his name was visible even at this distance, a jagged line that ran from his left temple to his jaw. The first shots rang out when the attackers came within 200 yards of the camp. Tom Bradley, positioned on a water tower with the best vantage point, opened fire with deadly accuracy. His first shot knocked one of Wilson's lieutenants from his saddle. and his second sent another outlaw's horse crashing to the ground. The sound of gunfire seemed to release all the tension that had been building in the camp. Suddenly, the air was filled with the crack of rifles and the shouts of men as the defenders opened up from their concealed positions. The careful preparations of the morning paid off immediately. Wilson's men found themselves riding into a coordinated crossfire instead of the panicked chaos they had expected. But the outlaws were experienced fighters who had survived many battles. Instead of retreating in the face of unexpected resistance, they spurred their horses forward and sought cover behind the scattered equipment and supply wagons that dotted the camp's periphery. Samuel found himself in the thick of the fighting as Wilson's northern flanking force tried to break through the defensive line. The railroad workers fought with the desperate courage of men protecting their families, using pickaxes and sledgehammers as weapons when their few guns ran out of ammunition. Running Bear and his warriors proved to be devastating fighters in the close-quarters combat that developed around the camp's edges. The chief moved like a ghost through the smoke and confusion, appearing behind enemy positions to strike with silent efficiency. His war cry when it came seemed to freeze the blood of even the hardened outlaws. The battle's turning point came when O'Sullivan led a counterattack against Wilson's eastern flank. The Irish foreman had organized a group of the burliest track layers into an assault team, and they charged the outlaw position with the same coordinated precision they used to lay railroad ties. Wilson himself seemed everywhere at once, rallying his men and leading charges against the strongest points of the camp's defense. Samuel caught glimpses of the outlaw leader through the smoke and dust, always surrounded by his most loyal followers, always pushing his men to break through the defensive line. The fight raged for what seemed like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. The camp's defenders were holding their ground but barely. Several of the railroad workers had been wounded, and ammunition was running dangerously low. If Wilson's men mounted one more coordinated assault, the defense might crumble. That was when Mary Henderson did something that changed the course of the battle. The 8-year-old girl had been watching the fight from the supply car where the children were sheltered, and she had noticed something that the adult defenders had missed. A group of Wilson's men had worked their way around to the camp's southern edge, where they were preparing to attack the supply cars directly. If they succeeded, they would not only capture the children but also gain access to the camp's ammunition reserves. Instead of crying or hiding, Mary slipped out of the supply car and ran through the chaos of the battle to find Samuel. Bullets whined overhead and men shouted all around her, but the little girl dodged through the confusion with the quick reflexes of childhood. "Mr. Mackenzie," she called out as she reached Samuel's position. "There are bad men coming to get the children." "They're hiding behind the big water barrel." Samuel looked where she pointed and saw that she was right. A half-dozen outlaws had indeed worked their way into position to attack the supply cars. In moments, they would overrun the women and children who represented everything the defenders were fighting to protect. There was no time to organize a proper response. Samuel grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the threatened position, calling for Running Bear and anyone else who could hear him to follow. It was a desperate gamble that left his own defensive position undermanned, but the children had to be protected. The running gunfight that followed was unlike anything in Samuel's experience. He found himself firing on the move, taking cover behind railroad equipment and engaging outlaws at point-blank range. Running Bear appeared beside him like a vengeful spirit, and together they carved their way through Wilson's men with a combination of rifle fire and hand-to-hand combat. The counterattack succeeded, but at a cost. Samuel took a bullet in his left shoulder that sent him spinning to the ground. Running Bear was grazed by another shot that left blood streaming down his face. But the supply cars were safe, and Wilson's southern assault had been broken. As Samuel struggled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder, he saw Wilson himself approaching through the smoke. The outlaw leader had abandoned his horse and was advancing on foot, a pistol in each hand and murder in his eyes. "You've cost me a lot of money, rancher," Wilson snarled as he drew closer. "Those children were worth a fortune across the border, and now half my men are dead or wounded. Time to pay the price." Samuel raised his rifle with his good arm, but Wilson was faster. The outlaw's first shot went wide, but his second caught Samuel in the leg and sent him crashing to the ground. Wilson approached for the killing shot, his scarred face twisted with rage. That was when the most unexpected sound in the world reached their ears: the whistle of an approaching train. The afternoon supply run from El Paso was arriving early, and with it came a car full of Texas Rangers who had been investigating reports of outlaw activity in the area. The sound of that whistle seemed to take the heart out of Wilson's remaining men. They had signed up to attack a defenseless railroad camp, not to fight a pitched battle against armed lawmen. Within minutes, the surviving outlaws were retreating toward their horses, leaving their wounded behind in their haste to escape. Wilson himself realized that his grand plan had collapsed into disaster. Instead of capturing hundreds of people for the slave markets, he was facing capture or death at the hands of the Texas Rangers. With a final curse, he turned and ran toward his horse, abandoning his men to save himself. As the train pulled into the camp and the Rangers deployed to pursue the fleeing outlaws, Samuel lay on the ground thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He was wounded and exhausted, but alive. More importantly, the Henderson children were safe, and Wilson's reign of terror had been dealt a crippling blow. Mary Henderson appeared beside him again, this time carrying a cup of water that one of the women had given her. "Are you going to be okay, Mr. Mackenzie?" she asked with the serious concern of a child who had seen too much violence. Samuel managed a weak smile as he accepted the water. "I think so, Mary. Thanks to you, we all are." 3 months had passed since the battle at the railroad camp, and Samuel Mackenzie sat on the porch of his ranch house watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. His left arm was still stiff from the bullet wound he had received, but the doctors in San Antonio had assured him that he would regain full use of it with time. The Henderson children had become a permanent part of his household, a development that surprised no one who knew Samuel well. Mary had taken to ranch life with the adaptability of youth, learning to ride horses and help with the everyday tasks that kept the operation running. Jimmy, now 6 years old, followed Miguel around like a devoted puppy, absorbing everything the patient tracker could teach him about reading signs and understanding the land. The legal arrangements had been surprisingly simple. With no other living relatives and Samuel willing to provide for them, the territorial judge had readily approved the adoption. Martha would have loved having children in the house, Samuel often thought, and somehow their presence seemed to bring her memory closer rather than pushing it away. The aftermath of the railroad camp battle had brought changes that rippled far beyond Samuel's personal life. The Texas Rangers had used the information provided by captured outlaws to track down and destroy 2 more of Scar Wilson's hideouts. Wilson himself had escaped into Mexico, but his organization had been shattered, and the territory was safer for his absence. Captain James Morrison of the Texas Rangers had visited the ranch several times, both to debrief Samuel about the events and to discuss the possibility of him joining the Rangers in an official capacity. The offer was tempting, but Samuel had declined. He had responsibilities now that went beyond his own desires for adventure. The railroad had completed the line through the area without further incident, bringing new prosperity to the region. Patrick O'Sullivan had been promoted to district supervisor, and he made a point of stopping by the ranch whenever business brought him through the area. The Irish foreman had become something of a local hero, and his account of the battle had been published in newspapers as far away as New York. Running Bear had returned to his people, but the relationship between the Comanche band and the local ranchers had been permanently changed by their cooperation during the crisis. Trade agreements that had been impossible to negotiate for years were suddenly being worked out with surprising ease. The chief visited the ranch regularly, and his warriors sometimes helped with the spring roundup in exchange for cattle. But it was the children who had truly transformed Samuel's life. Mary had proven to be remarkably resilient, though she still had nightmares about the attack on her family's homestead. She had started attending the new school that had been established in the growing town nearby, and her teachers reported that she was an exceptional student with a particular talent for mathematics. Jimmy's recovery had been slower, but he was beginning to show flashes of the happy child he had been before the tragedy. He had formed a special bond with a young colt that had been born shortly after their arrival at the ranch, and caring for the animal seemed to give him a sense of purpose and joy. Samuel had also made changes to his ranch operations that reflected his new priorities. He had hired additional hands and built better housing for his workers, creating what amounted to a small community centered around the ranch. A doctor made regular visits, and Samuel had established a fund to help workers deal with family emergencies. The changes hadn't gone unnoticed by his neighbors. Some of the other ranchers grumbled about Samuel spoiling his workers and setting unrealistic expectations for the rest of them. But the results spoke for themselves. Samuel's ranch had the most loyal and productive workforce in the region, and his cattle operation continued to prosper. One evening, as Samuel was helping Mary with her arithmetic homework, she looked up at him with the serious expression that reminded him so much of her mother. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, "why did you come looking for us that day? You didn't even know us." It was a question that Samuel had been expecting, but he still found it difficult to answer. How could he explain to an 8-year-old the complex mix of conscience, duty, and simple human decency that had driven his decision? "Sometimes," he said finally, "we have to make choices about what kind of people we want to be. When I found out that children were in danger, I couldn't just walk away and pretend it wasn't my problem." Mary nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Is that why you let us stay here? Because you wanted to be the kind of person who takes care of children who don't have anywhere else to go?" Samuel smiled at her directness. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly because this house was too quiet without the sound of children laughing." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, who had news from town. A letter had arrived from the territorial governor, formally recognizing Samuel's actions during the Wilson crisis and offering him a position as a special territorial marshal with authority throughout the region. Samuel read the letter twice, considering the implications. The position would give him the legal authority to pursue criminals across territorial boundaries and coordinate with both the Texas Rangers and the military when necessary. It was an honor that few civilian ranchers had ever received, but it would also mean spending time away from the ranch and the children who had become his family. As he weighed the decision, Mary appeared at his elbow. "What does the letter say?" she asked with the curiosity that seemed to drive everything she did. Samuel explained about the governor's offer, and Mary listened with the serious attention she gave to all important matters. "Would you have to go away a lot?" she asked when he finished. "Sometimes," Samuel admitted, "when there were bad people who needed to be stopped." Mary was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at him with a smile that reminded him why he had made all those difficult choices. "I think you should do it," she said. "Jimmy and I will be okay here with Miguel and Jake. And if there are other children out there who need help like we did, you should be the one to help them." It was then that Samuel realized the true impact of his decision to rescue the Henderson children. He had thought he was saving them, but in many ways they had saved him. They had given him a purpose beyond his own success and comfort, a reason to use his skills and resources for something larger than himself. The next morning, Samuel sat down at his desk and wrote 2 letters. The first was to the territorial governor, accepting the position of special marshal. The second was to his lawyer in San Antonio, establishing a trust fund that would ensure Mary and Jimmy would be provided for regardless of what happened to him in his new role. As he sealed the letters, Samuel thought about the chain of events that had started with smoke rising from a distant homestead. A moment of curiosity had led to a choice that had changed not only his life, but the lives of countless others. The Henderson children had found a new family. The railroad workers had been saved from a terrible fate, and Scar Wilson's reign of terror had been ended. Standing on his porch that evening, watching Mary and Jimmy play with the ranch dogs while Miguel kept a watchful eye on them, Samuel Mackenzie reflected on the truth he had learned through those difficult days. Sometimes the most important choices in life came without warning, demanding immediate action based on nothing more than conscience and courage. He had frozen in place when he first heard Mary's cry, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was contemplating, but in the end, he had made the choice that defined not just who he was, but who he wanted to be, and that Samuel realized had made all the difference.